Welcome to another infographic instant with Brian Michael. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the opportunities in shadow banking and particularly the different sectors that both current and aspiring shadow bankers can burst into in emerging markets. The paper that this infographic comes from looks at the ways that bankers can seize current opportunities in emerging markets in shadow banking. While many investment newsletters and professionals talk about formal financial institutions, there is roughly a $1 trillion market opportunity for those potential shadow bankers that are interested and willing to take advantage of the opportunities that we discuss in this paper and in other fora. Turning our attention now to the infographic, we describe some of the opportunities in what we call the emerging dozen. These are the 12 emerging markets with potential shadow banking opportunities. Let's talk about each country in turn, looking at the infographic together. In Mexico, we observe an 82% correlation with a large and growing insurance and pension sector. Thus, in Mexico, it is this insurance and pension sector that represents one of the biggest liquidity pools and one of the fastest growing areas for aspiring shadow bankers. In Chile, we observe roughly the same story as Mexico, but only with a 32% correlation between insurance and pensions, and indeed we see shrinking insurance and pension sector, so the opportunity is different in this respect in Chile than in Mexico. In Argentina, there's a negative 66% correlation between banking sector size, and Argentina's shadow economy has increased as a share of total assets by about 7% since 2002. Also, the sector is highly volatile, as shown by one of the highest standard deviations among the group. That means, and we'll see later, that Argentina has represented one of the fastest growing shadow banking sectors, but there are significant risks in the sector as evidenced by start and stop fits, particularly among some of the subsectors in Argentinian shadow banking sector. Turning our attention to Brazil, we see roughly the same story, with roughly a 21% share of shadow banking in total financial institutional asset holdings. In South Africa, we see that shadow banking has substituted basically for all other kinds of banking. Shadow banking has expanded by 12% to reach about 23% of all assets held by financial institutions. Thus, shadow banking in Africa has played a very important surrogate for aspiring companies seeking capital in order to grow. Saudi Arabia, there's little to report about shadow banking in the kingdom. It has a relatively small size, growth, and change, suggesting that this is not one of the countries that large financial institutions want to rush into in order to seize opportunities. In contrast, Turkey has seen an expanding growth in public financial institutions, and shadow banking has taken over only about 4% of total finance, compared with banks snatching about 11% away mostly from the central bank. So while Turkey certainly does not represent the same moribund opportunities as Saudi Arabia, nevertheless, Turkey is much less dynamic from a shadow banking point of view than some of the other economies we talk about in the brief. In Russia, there's basically no shadow banking sector to speak of. And this is ironic given Russia's previous shadow economy and the very large role that interpersonal relationships play in financial relationships in Russia. Turning our attention now to India, shadow banking has risen along with the insurance at the expense of formal public and private banks. Shadow banking has taken roughly a 7% share of total assets, and in turning our attention to China, we see roughly the same story as India, a relatively vibrant clipping shadow banking sector. Indonesia, shadow banking has grown in line with banks and insurance and pension institutions, and we also see a relatively good growth in the area of non-formal institutions throughout this whole Southeast Asian region. Thus, stepping back for a minute and looking at shadow banking opportunities in general, we see that different countries paint a very different picture in terms of opportunities, and there are certain economies that aspiring shadow bankers want to target in order to seize this very large opportunity. This has been another infographic instant with Brian Michael.